dear authorities, professors, ambassadors, former students of MIB Trieste School of Management, actual students also belonging to different universities in Italy and abroad, and in Russia, of course. It is a pleasure for all of us to start this conference with Mr. Sergio Romano, former Italian ambassador, historian, columnist, and one of the most active Italian intellectuals nowadays. Our conversation with Mr. Sergio Romano today is focused on Russia. Why Russia? Because he just published a book whose title is Processo, alla, Russia, a Tale. And in this book, Ambassador Romano has been analyzing Russia not only as a country, but Russia as a culture, Russia as a people, Russia as a dimension of the world life. It is an amazing analysis of the evolution of Russian people, starting from the very beginning when Prince Vladimir in Kiev accepted to convert to the Christian Orthodox religion, to the Christian religion, and then to the Christian Orthodox religion, to the expansion and the extension in the eastern side of the Russian area. Mr. Romano, in his book, is giving us an incredible fresco of the evolution of the Russian people. From the very old ages, with the first Tsar, with the quite confused age in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, and then through the expansion of the Russian Empire after several wars versus the neighbor kingdom, the neighbor civilizations, among them Polish, Lithuanian, Swedish, Ottoman Empire. Russia has been building its own sense of nation. Professor Romano also wrote very interesting pages on the personality of the main Tsar, from Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great, from Catherine II until the most recent Tsar, of course, including all the, would say, the monarchy of Romanov. The history of Russia is important to better understand Russia today. Russia today, which is largely unknown very often in the area outside of Russia. Our school, as many other schools, they pay a lot of attention on the history of international relations, on the analysis of the political environment, on the geopolitical aspect of international relations that are also connected with the international business and the international cultural dimension. During this conversation, which will last 90 minutes, 1 hour and a half, we will take the first part. I will make a very short introduction on the book, and then I will start to ask some questions to Ambassador Sergio Romano. He will answer to 2 or 3 questions of mine, and after 45, 50 minutes, we will start to have a debate, an open debate, in which everyone can intervene by asking a question. We will keep all the microphone mutes in the first part, so we will not have problems with background noises. And then when we start the debate, we will give you the access to ask your own question. But meanwhile, of course, you may write down your question on our chat, write to me the question, so I will then give you the floor and you will ask by yourself the question. But when you ask the question, please do not make a conference, be very short in your questions, so we give most of the time to the audience to interact and to ask a question to Professor Romano. So Russia, we have an idea of Russia. And when we say we are, Trieste School of Management is in Trieste in Italy. We are part of Europe, of Western Europe, and we have an idea of Russia, which was, of course, conditioned by the different historical events that we had in the 20th century. Russia, during the monarchy, was an important power, mainly in the last 3 centuries in the European dimension. Russia has been, of course, affected by most of the event. The pleasure of reading the pages of this book of Ambassador Sergio Romano is also connected with the incredible capacity that he has to melt the historical analysis with reference with literature. We read, of course, sentences of Lev Tolstoy. We read the sentences of Alexander Pushkin. We read sentences, and not only about very important writers and poets, but very often with the less important poets and writers who gave, of course, interpretation of Russia, and gave, of course, to all the readers an interesting approach to understand Russia. And so in the book, of course, several pages are oriented toward the analysis concerning the war between France and Russia, the invasion by Napoleon troops. And after the war in 1812 and the rebirth of Russia, the peace after this incredible invasion, the analysis through the 19th century is essential. Is essential also to understand the growing opposition movement that we had in Russia in the second part of the 19th century. As we had in Europe, the growth of several socialist movements, the growth of movement claiming for reforms. And of course, Russia was an absolute monarchy. It was not a constitutional monarchy until the very moment in which Nicholas II decided to accept, to allow the people to have a Duma, an assembly. That was the beginning of the 20th century, the very delicate moment in which Russia and Nicholas II was not able to manage the internal movements and of course the violent attack against the monarchy, the different and several attempts that the Tsar and the other authorities were suffering during those years. But it was also a delicate period for the international relations, the decision of Russia to enter the First World War after having suffered a very, I would say, negative and painful defeat versus Japan, the period in which Nicholas II was showing solidarity towards the other Slavic population in Eastern Europe, such the Serb population, and the decision to enter the First World War. But that, as we know, was an incredible and I would say delicate decision that finally was also connected with the fall of the monarchy and the start of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Several pages of the book are dedicated to the personality of Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin, and Trotsky, and the the bilateral dimension of the power in the first months and years of the revolution, the difficulties that the Bolshevik had in order to protect the revolution also in front of the ingerence of the interference done by the different international powers. This is an amazing period of our history, of the history of Europe, the period in which then the new country, the Soviet Union, was quite isolated after the First World War and re-entered the international diplomacy step by step, also because of the importance of the geopolitical alliances with some European countries, mainly France. The period of Joseph Stalin, the difficult period, the end of the new economic policy of Lenin, the elimination of the kulaks and the consolidation of the Soviet society with Stalin, the victory in the Second World War, the heroic victory in the Second World War, and the capacity of the Soviet army to not only to contain the German invasion, but also then to retaliate and to arrive till Berlin. That was a crucial moment, probably the most important moment of the Soviet Union. But then it is so interesting to read the pages concerning the period after the Second World War, after the death of Stalin, the Cold War, the transition with Khrushchev, the period concerning the crisis, such as the Cuba crisis in 1961 and 62, the competition with the United States of America, the competition not only in the political, of course, dimension, but also the competition in the economic dimension, in the competition in the philosophical and ideological dimension. That was the second part of the Cold War, until the moment in which the Soviet Union had to face a new recovery in the United States of America during the period of Ronald Reagan. It was, of course, the 80s. And that was the period in which Ambassador Sergio Romano, at the end of the 80s, was Italian ambassador in Moscow. Today, we also have the pleasure to have with us today's ambassador, Italian ambassador in Moscow, His Excellency, Mr. Pasquale Terracciano. We welcome him and we thank him a lot for being present during this conversation. So the period of Gorbachev, the reforms of Gorbachev, the elective of Gorbachev, and finally the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the birth of many new countries, former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, Russia, of course, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all those Soviet republics that were part of the Soviet Union and finally in 1991 became independent. And the last 30 years, the recovery of Russia. Maybe some of our students of MGIMO in Moscow and Professor Tatiana Zonova, who is also present with us, and we thank her to be present. Remember that two years ago, we also presented with students of MGIMO the previous book of Ambassador Sergio Romano on Putin. And that was a monography on Vladimir Putin and of the personality of Putin. The last pages of this book are focused on what he calls the new man who was Vladimir Putin after the period of Boris Yeltsin, after the reforms, the plan of privatization that we had during the period in the 90s, and when Vladimir Putin at the end of the 90s took the power. As we know, we almost never let the power, even during the period of Medvedev, Putin was the prime minister of Russia. But Putin is the prime minister of Russia also because he is highly welcome in Russia. His popularity is extremely high. The Russian people think that Putin is the best protector of the Russian interest, even though in the last years we had several crises. Even though in the last years we had the crisis, as we know, in Ukraine, we had the crisis in Georgia, we had the crisis in the very last weeks, we had crisis in Azerbaijan and Armenia, in Caucasus area. We had the crisis in many, of course, different areas of the world. And Russia was, of course, a fundamental actor in this. So this is, in very few minutes, the content of this amazing and extremely pleasant analysis on Russia. So now I would start to ask a first question to Ambassador Sergio Romano. When he finally attained the conclusion of this book and he gives us an overview of today's Russia, and of course the big question is how to understand Russia, because very often also our Russian colleagues, our Russian students, our Russian friends, very often they say to us, to the Western Europe, to the United States, they say, you don't know Russia, you don't know how to understand Russia. But what we do not understand even today is why very often Russia is highly, he could consider highly as a negative country. Why there is a negative opinion on Russia. In the last years also, Russia made something to help the rest of the world. Can we remind, for instance, the contribution of Russia to defeat the Islamic State in the Middle East? And we can, of course, remind also the contribution that even during this coronavirus pandemic, Russia gave, for instance, to our country, to Italy. We can select several topics concerning the help that Russia tried to give to the international community. But still in the Western countries, there is quite an opposition to Russia. In the last years, we had the sanctions against Russia because of the crisis in Ukraine and Crimea. And the sanctions has been renewed after 6 months in the European Union framework. So, Ambassador Romano, my first question would be, why, in your opinion, there is still such a negative feeling versus Russia in the Western European countries and in many other areas of the world?
Yes, well, I think that we ought to go back to the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, of course, it was in the interest of both sides to present the other one as a potential enemy and a dangerous enemy, and criticize him for internal policy. This was done by the United States, of course, concerning Russia, and also by the Russians, by the Soviets rather, concerning the United States and the West. You mustn't forget that for at least 20 years, the ruling classes of the Western Europe and the United States were still afraid and had not forgotten what they considered the Bolshevik danger, the possibility of communism in Western Europe and the United States. It was obviously also useful for Western governments to have an enemy. It is easier to govern your country when you have an enemy that may help to mobilize public opinion against it. So that is also has to be remembered. We mustn't forget, however, that a number of efforts were made to establish better relations. There was people in the United States who knew Russia, Kennan, for example, who came up with very constructive proposals for the relations with Russia. it was also true that Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party managed to be a go-between between Russia and the Soviet Union and other Western countries. In other words, I think that the need for an enemy is also an important element. You know, I always remember that when General Eisenhower left the office, made a speech, and during that speech, he said that he had understood, he had discovered that during the years of the Cold War, something had happened in the United States, the birth of something that he called the industrial military system. The industrial military system was, of course, managed, directed by the companies in the United States that made weapons. And making weapons became an extraordinary business for a country that now turns out to be still very well armed. Well, we shouldn't forget that, because I think that it is very important. The Cold War presented for the complex, for the military industrial complex, an extraordinary advantage. They could go on building weapons, research, manufacturing new weapons. So I think there is a bit of nostalgia in the United States for that sort of situation. I know it's a bit malignant on my part, but that nostalgia can explain why there is for the Cold War some nostalgia.
Thank you. But there was a moment in which, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a chance to establish with Russia, with Russian Federation, a solid cooperation. I'm referring, for instance, to the agreement that we hosted in Italy in 2002 in Pratica di Mare. And then finally it didn't work. Why, in your opinion?
Well, I think that you've got to go back again to something that is also very important. Russia has gone through very difficult periods in its history, and the Mongolians, of course, the Tatars, whatever you want to call them, were an important, terrible page for the country. The country had a feeling that it was becoming barbarian. And from that point on, one of the main desires of Russia, and going on to the Soviet Union, was absorb as much as possible the lessons coming from Europe. That was an important element of Russian history. Europe was something to be absorbed, imitated, learned from. There was an exaggeration in that sort of thing, but you mustn't forget, however, that much improvement came from, in fact, from the West. Germany has been an enemy of Russia on many occasions, and yet is the country from which Russia learned more over the years, industrially, scientifically, and also politically. And I was personally convinced after the war that there was a great field for work together. There is no doubt that Russia needed a great deal of help from the West, and we were the possibility. We had the possibility to supply what was mainly needed, and this was particularly true again another period alike after the fall of communism. The arrival of Gorbachev, Gorbachev was a reformer, and after all, what did he want to do? I mean, he wanted to introduce in Russian economy something that that Europe and the West and the United States, of course, were rather good about. I mean, it was something that they knew, something that they helped to create, and they could be very helpful. When I was in Moscow, and I think I understood Gorbachev's project, and I always thought that we should be able to help Russia along that line, whether it was Gorbachev or Boris Yeltsin or somebody else. That wasn't necessary. That was not important. The important thing was to be aware that Russia was ready to learn, and that we could also learn from Russia, and that we could, and that both sides could enormously profit from it. It didn't work. First of all, it didn't work because a number of people, a number of countries in Russia still considered the Russia potentially dangerous. I'm talking about Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, maybe a little less, but and those countries, of course, wanted to be protected, felt that they needed to be protected, and who could protect them better than NATO? So those countries were invited to join NATO for a number of reasons. Political. Germany wanted to have friendly countries around their borders. The Germans wanted to have friendly countries around their borders. The United States wanted to have satellites in Europe, and they did not like the policy of United Europe. United Europe is not particularly liked by American governments and American politicians, whereas the presence in NATO of countries that had been satellites of the Soviet Union was something that Washington liked very much. And as a result, we found ourselves with having within NATO countries whose particular desire is to be protected by the United States. And that, of course, has created a climate of potential crisis with Russia. And by the way, it was also bad for Western Europe and for United Europe, because those countries were particularly interested in having good relations with Washington, not with Brussels. Washington was much more considered a friend and an ally than United Europe. And all this was not a climate, the right climate for a good relationship with Russia. So in the end, we have done very little to seize an opportunity that was there.
But after Pratica di Mare, after Russia was invited to cooperate with NATO in a joint Russia-NATO council, that was, of course, in the emotional wave after September 11, the starting part of a huge terrorist attack against the Western civilization. And then Russia and also China were cooperating at the first moment. But then during the George Bush administration, George Bush's son, of course, and even with the Barack Obama administration, the bilateral relations they were declining, and we went toward a new Cold War. In your opinion, who was mostly responsible for that?
Well, I think the greater responsibility was with the West. It is quite true that we had an opportunity at Pratica di Mare, and it was quite obvious the climate should be, the opportunity should be seized immediately. But then, as I told you, the arrival of other countries coming from Eastern Europe changed the mood. A change of political military establishment within the United States was also important. People within the State Department and the Department of Defense had other policies in their mind, and they did not consider that getting along with those who would have worked with the Russians was particularly useful to their staying in the business, so to speak. I think we took the wrong turn. I think historians will have to work harder on why we did, because the opportunity was there, and opportunity was deliberately missed. I think this is quite wrong.
As a matter of fact, also when Barack Obama went to the White House, there was a good start. You remember it was the so-called reset policy with Russia, and also the treaty, the disarmament treaty that Barack Obama signed with Medvedev on the 10th of April 2010 to reduce the strategic nuclear weapons was a good moment of detente between Russia and the United States and Russia and the Western countries. But after that, we had several events, several aspects that contributed to the deterioration. In my opinion, the issue of Ukraine was fundamental to explain the starting of a deterioration of the relations between Russia and the Western countries. What do you think about?
Well, I should begin from before the Ukraine, because you see, you mustn't forget that while we were on some occasions having a line, positive line toward Russia, we were also introducing into NATO the countries of Eastern Europe. And NATO is not an alliance, and it's not a traditional alliance. Political alliance, traditional alliances are made for people, for countries to help each other at the time of need. NATO is not a country that helps you at the time of need. NATO is an alliance to go to war. The very organization of NATO is the preparation of war. Preparation of war for trainings, for research, creation of new weapons. And how would you feel if you were Russian and see that the countries you ought to get along with, because we all can help each other, fill themselves with new countries that have a bias with Russia into an alliance that is designed to prepare war? What could you expect from Russia? I wasn't surprised, frankly, when I saw that the Russians were also doing things that were wrong in many senses, displaying certain weapons. All this was not, it shouldn't have been done. But it was done by people who felt that they were surrounded by NATO, an alliance, as I told you, that is designed to prepare and make war.
Sure. In the Western countries, very often there are feelings, negative feelings versus Russia, also concerning the lack sometimes of transparency in Russia, the not perfect democracy in Russia, the authoritarian approach of the president, the issue concerning the opposition in Russia, that it is extremely weak and it does not have the chance to develop itself. Some people in the Western countries, they think that this is a weak point of Russia and they accuse Russia not to do anything to do that. But of course, Russia has a different dimension, and to administer Russia is not like to administer a small country. So, in your opinion, how can we share this this opinion of the Western countries versus Russia? Is this concrete in your opinion, or sometimes it is just justified and explained with the anti-Russian feeling?
Well, the Eastern countries of Europe also have their arguments. I mean, they definitely remember the Soviet period, and the Soviet period was a period of occupation, their territory. So that remains. But there are too many people who are interested in pursuing a policy of opposition and counter-opposition. And it's very difficult to break this tendency, break this trend. Very difficult indeed. But we should go on and try again. Anyway, the United Europe could have a policy different, should have a policy quite different from the policy of the United States. And I think that should there be within the European Union a stronger tendency to European sovereignty, which, by the way, begins to be seen, becomes more visible now than it was 1 or 2 years ago. I think the French president should be thanked for the job that he's doing, it seems to me. But anyway, the condition exists. The conditions exist and they are rational and they should be used. So I try to explain why it didn't happen, but it should happen, it could happen, and we got to go on trying, because the day we just stop trying, it can only be worse. For example, I try to explain Putin. I know Putin defects. I wouldn't want to have a prime minister like Putin, but let us try to understand why Putin pursues the policy of a restorer. After all, I mean, there was a great Russia at the time of the Soviet Union. And if I were Russian, I would try to help to restore the credibility, the legitimacy, the pride of that moment. It was communist, and I wasn't a communist, but I can understand national pride. And where national pride exists, it should be respected.
Sure. And you also explained that in your previous book on Putin about that. It was quite clear. Moreover, it was 2 years ago, also a very interesting period. We remember that was the period in which Putin was going toward the new presidential election. He pronounced a speech in the beginning of March of 2018 in close to the Kremlin in Moscow. And with this speech, it was a kind of State of the Union speech. And he was explaining also the aims of Russia. And he also presented a new category of weapons in order to protect the country in front of the new ambitions also of other countries, and namely about the United States, because there was the huge issue concerning the anti-missile weapons and the fact that the Russians could build some weapons that could not be detected by anti-missiles, and so they can protect, of course, themselves in front of a first strike. We go back to the Cold War. There is a new Cold War that is going on, and it seems that Russia could reply in a very relevant way to the challenges that Washington and Western Europe were sending to Russia after the crisis in Ukraine. But what do you think about the last orientation? There is, for instance, and I start now to read some of the questions that are written on the chat by our audience. There is a former student of MIB, Sergio Buttignoni, who has origins in Pola, in Istria, and he asked you about the crucial relations with China. An alternative for Russia was to turn its head in Asia, toward Asia, and to establish with Russia a new partnership. Also taking into consideration the very important Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the common military maneuvers that they organized last year in Vostok, close to Vladivostok, in Siberia, and all those initiatives that tells us a lot about the alternative solutions that Russia has in front of itself if the Western countries are adopting an hostile attitude versus Moscow. What do you think about?
Well, I think that when there is a hostile climate, this is generally speaking due to the desire of a country or the parts of the country to justify in front of public opinion their political line, and acting a great deal as much as possible on patriotic sentiments. Nationalism becomes an instrument extremely useful for if you are in a climate of conflict, of potential conflict. And that is what I can see being done between Russia and China, and of course also between European countries and China. You see, I understand China, or rather I try to understand China. I mean, I remember that it was an empire, that empire was destroyed by Western democracies. That empire was destroyed by the Western democracies. And of course, as it goes on, we still like to consider China a potential enemy. When you need a potential enemy to better govern, the situation becomes difficult to control.
Sure, sure. But it seems also, you remember that Russia is having more diplomatic initiatives, mainly in the Asian framework and in the Middle East framework. I'm referring, for instance, to the meeting that Putin had with Kim Jong-un in Vladivostok last year, that was representing the opening of a new potential, I would say, communication, or tool of communication with the country, which is, as we know, in the middle of a major concern from the international community. Another example would be, of course, the initiative of Russia in Middle East, the intervention in Syria, and as I was explaining before, also the contribution to defeat the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria in Syria. And then the new, I would say, the new relations with Turkey, very delicate relations. And a few days ago, we read about the new ceasefire agreement in Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Nagorno Karaback area. Our newspaper presents Russia as the main actor in this, and the fact that Russia is taking some responsibilities to give a contribution also to reestablish peace. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not surprised after all, because even during the Tsarist period, Russia had a Middle Eastern policy. They felt that it was their old battles with the Ottoman Empire that had never really finished, in a sense, because everything that happened in the Middle East, as you look at it from Moscow, concern your Asian republics, the countries more near, the regions of Russia more closer to that area. And now, you know, there is also another law that we should never forget. The longer peace lasts, the more preparations for war go to work.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Thank you. Some of our students, I take, for instance, the question of Yelena Maslova, who is a Russian young intellectual in Moscow. She's mentioning the fact that in 2019, when there was the visit of the president of the Italian parliament, Maria Elisabetta Casellati in Moscow, she mentioned the fact that we should go back to the spirit of Pratica di Mare. She was, of course, referring to the bilateral relations between Italy and Russia. And what can we say about that today? Do we realize that there is a will of the Italian government to reestablish the spirit of Pratica di Mare, which means to establish a lasting, deep partnership with Russia in the economic field, in the business field, in the diplomatic field, and in the cultural field? Which is your perception of that?
The question for me or for the lady?
No, it's a question for you. The lady is asking you that.
I see. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I keep saying that the occasions exist and should be seized. And I think, of course, I do understand why it is difficult to do so. There is no doubt. But the occasions exist. The Pratica di Mare, I've mentioned it a number of times when I write something about the problem, but I have no illusions at the time being. I don't think that that we are ready. Italian politics are going through a very difficult period. There is a certain stability, undoubtedly, but Italian politicians and Italian political parties are mainly busy with their existence and their survival. And consequently, the time for a consistent, coherent foreign policy designed to last for a few years to have the effects that we hope for is not the time for Italian politics. Italian politics has got other problems to solve. A permanent instability. We are a liquid. We have a liquid policy. I don't know whether you understand what I mean. I mean, something that doesn't. That there is no cohesion. No. But
Sure.
that was well. This is not the subject of my book.
Going also to another question by Pier Giorgio Pagan, he's mentioning the fact that he read an article in which the author was questioning if Russia is really a state or just a congregation of local interest. And those local interests were erased during the period of communism. But when the Communist Party disappeared, those local particular interests are still there. Do you have the same perception?
Well, to begin with, I'm not so surprised. The bigger you are, the more numerous, the more parties and points of view and interest you have within your borders. There is you talk about Russia, yes, of course. I mean, take a look at the United States, California and San Francisco and Detroit. Yes, of course, they are linked, they are tied by common interest. But if you really want to compare their economic policy, for example, San Francisco and Detroit could be very well the enemies rather than friends. And this is true of all sorts of large countries, particularly when they have an empire, an imperial structure, so to speak. In particular, There is another problem, unfortunately, that we haven't mentioned yet. Democracy is going through a very difficult period. When the Soviet Union collapsed, I was in Moscow at the time, and it was quite obvious that the people who did not want to live in the Soviet Union anymore needed an example, needed something that would inspire them. They had to be inspired by something that you believe into. Now democracy is not going through a good period. Sovereignism, populism, political and financial crisis, an atmosphere of continuous bargaining and continuous complaining. Look at what happened a few days ago when at one point Macron, the French president, said something about the Islam that obviously were not liked by other countries. In other words, we are going through a period in which parliaments are not really anymore what they had been at the highest of their season. We are not the House of Commons, and we are not even because the House of Commons has disappeared. Is Boris Johnson an estimable member of the House of Commons? I mean, is it an example of how a parliamentarian should be? I'm talking about the British Prime Minister, of course. You see? Yes. When democracy is not the medicine that could cure your disease because it has diseases itself, what do you do?
Of course, of course. I would like also now to open the debate and the discussion. I just asked to you some questions that our participants were writing. I will now extend another couple of questions to you, and then I will give the floor to some of the participants so they will ask you directly their question. But first, I would like to take a couple of questions that just arrived. One is the one that was sent by Georgis Nitko, who is raising the issue of the European security. And he mentioned the fact that Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel expressed in the last years the awareness that the Europe now should do alone about the security, and Europe should not count too much on the United States. That was probably right after the first approach of Donald Trump. Now, maybe things will change with Joe Biden. So the question is, do you think that Europe may establish a new cooperation also with Russia for the security? This is a hard question because it is affecting the future of NATO, of course. But as you know, we had a huge interview on the Corriere della Sera of Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron made an important interview, and he, in the interviews, he said something that he was already saying some months ago. The interview is yesterday, on Monday. He said America will understand. He said Europe will be sovereign with its own defense. And this is why France is offering to the European Union to count on the nuclear deterrence of the French forces in order to establish a security defense in Europe. Do you think that this idea of Emmanuel Macron, you remember he also declared that NATO is in a kind of mind death or cerebral death some months ago. Some observers were considering that France is offering itself as a new potential leader of this Europe going towards a a self-dimension of security. What do you think about?
Well, I can tell you what all sorts of people would say about this kind of thing. They would say that it's France again trying to impose its saying in the world, in Europe. It's the imperial sort of ambitions of France that never disappear. Well, that is not the way to go about it. Macron is quite right when he says that there cannot be a united Europe if there isn't a military Europe. In other words, we would not be credible, and we would not be active, we would not be useful to world politics unless we can speak with one voice when it comes to potential use of weapons. Now, we have had all sorts of crises in unstable parts of the Mediterranean and Africa and so on. If we had been able to act together in Libya, for example, Turkey wouldn't be there. If we had been able to act in a unified way in the Balkans, we wouldn't have the continuous instability that still characterizes that area. You have to have weapons. I know having weapons means that you become immediately suspected of other ambitions and other purposes. But this is not, of course, the danger does exist, but without an armed Europe, a military Europe, in other words, there will be no foreign policy. The moment comes when you are credible only if you can put weapons on the desk.
Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Franco Bruni, who is another professor of Bocconi University, vice president of ISPI, and also one of the professor of MIB. Please, Franco, open the microphone and ask your question to Ambassador Sergio Romano.
I'm also a good friend of Sergio. Yeah, my question is about the relationship between the economic situation and the international political attitude of Russia. Traditionally, we were thinking that when there are economic difficulties in Russia, the aggressiveness of its policy increases. But on the contrary, the old communist regime in Russia fell in part because of an economic difficulty. It was challenged on the economic ground also. And its failure produced a change of regime. So what about the future? What is going to happen in the future? Suppose that, for instance, with this pandemic, the crisis in Russia becomes very, very strong. Is this going to change in some way the attitude of Russia towards foreign policy in general, or and in what sense?
After the end of communism, I was convinced that there was a room for an enormous possibilities and potentials for cooperation. Russia is very rich on raw materials, has potentials that can be exploited. Russia has very good universities, very good science research, but it still has a mediocre economy. And this mediocre economy is bad for everybody, not just for the Russians. Of course, for the Russians, considerably more than for anybody else, because they're not benefiting from their wealth, from their enormous wealth. But it's bad for everybody because we could have a considerably happier Europe if we could work together. We, to help Russia be more ripe, so to speak, industrially, and And because we would also have a large market that we could use for our products. So there are all the possibilities for cooperation, and they've never been really exploited the way they should have been exploited. What can I say? I mean, I know it's difficult. I know there is jealousy on both sides. There is méfiance, dislike sometimes, bias, a great deal of bias. But the possibilities are there, and they should be used. I've always hoped so, and I thought that for a moment that was being possible. That was being possible. It was after the end of the Soviet Union at the time of Yeltsin. Gorbachev was still linked to the past. Yeltsin, paradoxically, were more free, mentally free, and we lost the opportunity. We lost the occasion.
But we can re-establish chances. There is a question coming from Yelena Alexienkova, who is a younger researcher of the Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And she would like to focus our attention on the interest of Russia in the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. And she asks you, how do you see the current role of Russia in the Eastern Mediterranean? Do you believe Russia and Italy may have common interest in that region and could cooperate in some frameworks?
Should I try to answer?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when we, at the time, were planning a war against Turkey for the conquest of Libya. And the war took place in 1911. And there was a meeting in Italy between the Tsar and the Prime Minister of the time, who was Giovanni Giolitti. And Giolitti told the Tsar that we wanted to Libya, and we would be glad and happy if Russia would not make it difficult for us to have Libya. The Tsar, I don't know how actually replied, but he certainly replied in a way that must have pleased Giolitti. But then the Tsar said that they had their eyes on the straits, the Dardanelles, and that they would be very happy if Italy closed an eye the day something happened. I'm sure that they explained themselves differently. They didn't use this very vulgar language that I'm using now. But that's how it should work. Maybe not the same conditions, but it's something along the line. There is always something I want and you can help me to get it. And there is something that you want and I can help you to get.
Sure, and that was the agreement also of Racconigi in 1909, that it was a very interesting agreement also on the statu quo in the Balkan region, because both countries, they had common interest in avoiding the expansion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Balkan region at that moment. But that was also an important green light for Italy to go on with the war against the Ottoman Empire at that moment in order to obtain what we say in Italy, la quarta sponda, so the Tripolitania and Cyrenaica region. We have several more questions. Martin Pozovan, who is a student of MGIMO, but he's from the Slovak Republic, he is asking you, how do you interpret the current Russian constitutional changes, and how does you see the Russian internal development in the coming years? In other words, the fact that Vladimir Putin may stay in the power several years. But we also read on the newspapers that also Putin might have some health problems. Who knows if this is true or not? But of course, the public opinion is wondering, and this is also the question of Engineer Pier Domenico. What will happen when Putin will exit from the power, and when that will just in case happen? Who knows? Of course, nobody can know the future. But which is your impression and perception of that?
Well, this is a very difficult game because you see, the disease of people of government are a constant problem for authoritarian regimes. The more you want to stay in power, and the less you want to give your power to somebody else, the more likely are to be sick at one point, because it's the length of, after all, I mean, if you stay in power 10, 20, 25, something sooner or later you're going to have it. Any medical doctor would confirm my very banal consideration. So what can I say? I can understand, on the other hand, why a country of the size of Russia needs continuity. And continuity is exactly the opposite of change in government. And if you think that continuity is fundamental and essential, not only for you and your personal ambitions, but also for the future of your country, that sooner or later is going to create a problem of change. The United States have solved the problem of change, and we have got a demonstration only a few weeks ago with the election of Joe Biden. But Russia, I believe, is going to have this problem all the time. There will be times when, first of all, Putin has not done badly. On many occasions, has also done useful things for his country, but he doesn't want to go. And if he doesn't want to go, and he gets sick when he doesn't want to go, you're going to have a double problem, not just a simple problem. That is the health of Mr. Putin. You got a problem for the health of your country.
Sure. So, of course, this is a big issue, because also many people wonder what will happen when Vladimir Putin will leave the power, and how Russia will ensure continuity. You were mentioning continuity, and continuity means also to keep some pillar of the foreign policy, because foreign policy is an important part, of course, of policy. And Russia, being the biggest country of the world, has a lot of issues concerning foreign policy, also concerning the neighbor country. Russia has a lot of neighbor countries and a lot of foreign policy, as a matter of fact. There is also a participant who is asking you if your passion for Russia is something that you got during your period in Moscow, in Russia, or if this interest that you have on Russia has been built during many years, during your diplomatic career, and during also your period of writing and studying Russia. Because it seems obvious, reading this beautiful book, that Russia attracts you, as attracts many people. It is beyond any sort of dispute that we have also in Europe many people that like a lot Russia, and many people that do not like Russia. Some people really hate Russia. So sometimes we wonder why. In your case, I don't think you are one of the person that hates Russia. So how did you, which was the evolution of your feeling about Russia, Ambassador Romano?
One thing, first of all, I mean, you said passion.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at passions. Passions are not my cavallo di battaglia, as we say. Um, well, I can tell you how it happened, however, because I was the Italian representative at NATO, and lots of things were happening. Oh, look like they may happen in Russia. I was bored at NATO. I was bored all the time. The big table, going around, complimenting each other, that sort of thing. I mean, it wasn't fun. And I had visited Russia on other occasions. I was always interested. I had read a great deal of Russian literature. Russian literature would I think, convert to some love for Russia, even in the biggest of enemy, because Russian literature is really an extraordinary medicine. And I decided that maybe I should leave Brussels, where as I told you, I was dying of boredom. And at that time, the Italian ambassador to Russia got sick, if I'm not mistaken, and could not stay any longer. He was a nice man. He knew the country well. He spoke Russian very, very, very well, but he couldn't stay. And they didn't know who to send, and I said I was ready to go, and I went. And when I arrived, of course, I couldn't imagine that there would be Gorbachev was already there, but we hadn't understood how important the reforms would be. And I immediately understood that something would happen in that country if I stayed long enough. I stayed long enough, and all sorts of things happened.
As a matter of fact, when we read your books, we do not only meet history, we do not only learn about what happened in the past, we do not only read about analysis of the today's environment, but we meet writers, poets. We meet, as I told you before, some of the Russian masters, and we meet Tolstoy, Chekhov, we meet Pushkin, we meet people that through literature, novels, but also poems, gave us a deep sense of the Russian culture. And this is, I would say, an element that we cannot find in many writers nowadays. So the capacity that has Ambassador Sergio Romano to associate the historical analysis and integrate it with the analysis of literature. And when you quote, this is another, of course, example of the fact that you have an interest and you like, of course, to quote, because those sentences strengthen, of course, what you say, and you build also on this your reasoning, your consideration on that. This is really an amazing and a fantastic aspect of, I think, of your book. I would like now to give the floor to Fabio Coacci, who is a PhD student at Migimo. He is from the University of Macerata. Please, Fabio, open your microphone and ask your question to Ambassador Sergio Romano.
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador, for the intervention. And my question for you is, do you see margins of improvement in the US-Russian relations with Biden's presidency due to a reduction of unpredictability, which was a feature of the Trump administration? Thanks.
Thank you. Biden is a question mark. We don't really know. We like him because we dislike the predecessor. And I think on top of that, that we should stop treating American elections as if it were something that happens in our home. This is a kind of, it's a servile attitude. We look as if really the results of an American election could change our life. There are lots of European politicians who start immediately writing articles about the effects, the consequences that the change of a man at the White House would have to the equilibriums of political parties in his own country. It's wrong. It's quite wrong. The situations are totally different, and we should not make this mistake. Having said so, there is no doubt that having experienced the strangeness of a president like Trump, at times ridiculous, at times tragically dangerous. Well, the arrival of this gentleman, of course, Irish, Catholic, liberal, socialist, is in a sense reassuring. It's a big country, and it's much better if it is ruled by somebody who's got the common sense, culture, and some intelligence, which wasn't the case with the predecessor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I also would like to give the floor to Natalia Skerova, who is a Russian student who is now working in Brussels. She takes advantage of the news that we had today in the newspaper about the elections in Moldova. Please, Natalia, open the microphone and ask your questions to Ambassador Sergio Romano.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can see you. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Pilotto and Your Excellency, for this thought-provoking conversation. It was very interesting to hear the European and Italian perspective about the current relations between Russia and Europe and Russia and Italy. I would like to pose the following question. So my question is about the recent elections in Moldova. As you know, a pro-European president has been elected in Moldova, which has risen many hopes in the European Union for better cooperation between the EU and Moldova. And do you think it will increase tensions between Russia and the EU, this election of a new president? Do you think a Ukrainian scenario could be possible in Moldova as well? That is my question. Thank you very much.
Moldova, unfortunately, is one of the former Soviet republics that we know less. The Romanians know Moldova. They follow well the events. They try to interpret. And I have occasionally contacts with Romanians that try to describe to me the local situation, but unfortunately, this is not a country that we understand much. We can follow Ukraine, I'm sorry, we can follow Ukraine a little better because we have more historical traditions, connections, and so on. Moldova, we have no. I'm sorry to say, but the truth is that we've never taken that country seriously. It's wrong. It's not nice at all. But if you want the truth, that is it.
Yeah, it is not a very big country. Natalia Skerova was wondering if something similar to what happened in Ukraine in 2013, 2014 may also happen in Moldova. But according to what you are saying, probably not, also because the importance of Moldova is not comparable with the importance of Ukraine. Am I right?
Yes, the Ukraine, I must say, we knew much more. It's a country that we have frequently visited. When I was in Moscow, I did go a number of times, and it's a country that is that we have studied, that we have greater familiarity. And if I can tell you the truth, I'm not convinced that we have dealt with wisdom at the time of the crisis. The crisis began when two Western countries offered the Ukrainians to enter in an economic area, And when we were talking about it, but we would certainly reach an agreement. There was a coup d'etat in the Ukrainian parliament, and the Ukrainian parliament was definitely chose that day a prime minister that would have definitely not favored the entry of Ukraine in an economic area patronized by Putin's Russia at the time. And that created the reaction of Putin that we know. It was the typical reaction of a restorer, or somebody whose main objective has always been to try and recreate as much as possible the authority of the former Russia that was called the Soviet Union. I've always understood, I understood why he was trying to do it, but sometimes it was done with an exaggerated enthusiasm. However, the business of Crimea shocked Europe. And that I didn't quite understand the shock, because Khrushchev gave Crimea to the Ukraine as a gift because he wanted to strengthen the relations between Russia and Ukraine at the time. Do you remember when Khrushchev? What was happening? It was happening that Ukraine, by accepting to go into another economic area, was really stepping out of the Russian world. So if you are given Crimea as a gift, which was Russian, given Crimea as a gift to strengthen relations with Ukraine, why don't take it back when you discover that Ukraine is not interested in staying in our area?
Yes, of course, a point that is representing a crucial aspect. We also have not only Russian students, also Ukrainian students that are very sensitive to this topic. And as we know, is concerning a land. So the part of the land is always having a symbol in the history. I would like to give the floor to our Dean and Director, to Professor Vladimir Nanut, who created our MIB Trieste School of Management and who is attending our meeting. Please, Professor Nanut, can you open your microphone and ask your question to Ambassador Sergio Romano?
Excellency, Ambassador, nice to meet you again. Of course, on distance, I will prefer to meet you again, like many times directly, and have the opportunity to speak to you and to discuss many other questions. But I would like to ask you that it's quite known that Putin and Russia helped the election of Donald Trump 4 years ago. And someone was wondering they will also tried to help again Trump to the last election. What do you think will be the relation of Russia and of Putin to the new administration of Joe Biden? Will change, or they will try to adapt their strategy to the new administration? Also concerned with the relation with EU, with the Europe, because Trump and Russia was allied in order to destroy the European Union. How do you see the future with the new administration of USA?
Well, I suppose you are talking about what the accusations against Putin at the time of the election of Trump was to try and intervene in an improper way using it. Yes, it was quite improper. It was also wrong. It was also mistaken because there was really nothing to get out of Trump. I think that this is the problem of Putin's origin. He comes from the KGB. The KGB is a sort of fatherland. Mind, I always known or thought to know that the KGB is like CIA, your second fatherland. The people who go through an institution that has an enormous esprit de corps and educate their members to be proud of their country. There is a great deal of patriotism in, but this is true also of MI5, MI6, and the CIA. That's how they are. So they very often and very frequently played against each other. It's a game. MI6 has gotten into difficulties with the KGB because KGB was doing exactly the same thing with MI6. There are little countries with an enormous pride and the desire to overcome the other in intelligence, in skillness, and so on and so on. So that was not an intelligent thing to do in my way. But it was a totally useless thing to do because Putin must have realized that trying to get Trump at the White House wasn't going to bring any advantage to Russia, none whatsoever.
As a matter of fact, Trump was saying before that he wanted to improve relations with Russia, but finally he didn't improve relations with Russia.
Yes.
Give the floor to Artem Voitko, who is a former student of MIB. He is Russian. I suppose he's in Moscow. Please, Artem, open your microphone and ask your questions very quickly because we would like to end our conference at 7:30, as I promised to Ambassador.
Thanks for the opportunity. First of all, Professor, I was typing my question because, you know, should be a filter always. Moreover, I stay in Moscow. Maybe I have something in my strange. But anyway, my first question is about your book, Mr. Romano. If it's going to be translated in Russian and will be officially published in Russia, so that we could be familiar with your book here. My first question and the second one, if we talk about our relations, the West and Russia, we talk about the move, the steps we all gotta do towards each other to get a positive effect, positive steps. In your opinion, what kind of steps, the first steps, both sides should do, Russia and the West, or Italy in particular, if we talk more about Italy and Russia? Thank you.
Pilotto, could you kindly repeat? There must be something with the sound here on this side of your room. Could you repeat the question, please, Pilotto?
repeat. First question is also a question of Carlo Albanese, who was wondering if your book is going to be translated into Russian language. Probably we should ask Professoressa Tatiana Zonova if it is possible, because Professoressa Tatiana Zonova knows she's Russian and she knows Italian language really perfectly. But first question is, do you think that your book will be translated into Russia? I imagine that our Russian students really would like to read it, and probably it could be translated. The second question is how the Western side and Russia may open a new positive period in their relations in the next future.
Say it again.
How the Western countries and Russia may open new relations in the future, new positive relations between Russia and Western countries. Is it possible, in your opinion?
Well, I've never been optimistic, but I'm so convinced, and I try to explain it, that there would be advantages for both, economic, culturally, scientifically, that if it doesn't happen, it's another occasion lost.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 7:30. We would like to respect the time. It was 1 hour and a half of conversation with an extraordinary intellectual that knows very well Russia and that intervenes almost daily in the debate over the international politics and international relations. On behalf of Professor Vladimir Nanut and on behalf of the whole MIB Trieste School of Management, we would like to thank all the participants to this conversation. We have been discussing, reasoning, thinking about that planet, which is called Russia. It's a big planet. It's the biggest country of the world. It has a huge extension. Even though it is not the most populated country of the world, it is not the most important economy of the world, but it is a country which has an important cultural, historical dimension. And I would quote now Ambassador Romano, as he ended one of his articles on the Corriere della Sera newspaper while he was analyzing the mistakes of Russia, but also the strengths of Russia. He was, of course, making a list of some of the mistakes that Russia did in the last years, but also he was making a list of all the positive aspects of Russia. And he finally ended his article by saying, taking into consideration that how is it possible not to like, of course, also Russia and to be attracted by that country. We had also many other questions. I apologize with our students, former students, and the audience if we could not ask all the questions that were proposed. But I think that we covered a lot of topics that are in front of us, and obviously the will to go on with the geopolitical analysis of the international environment is bigger and bigger. We do that in the different schools, in the business schools, in the universities, in foundations, in institutions. I thank a lot also the audience, the authority that were present tonight, and of course, Ambassador Romano, a big thank to you for your participation to this conversation and for the very interesting answer that you gave us to the very questions. Thank you very much, and we hope to organize soon other conferences for the benefit of all those that like international relations and modern history. Thank you
very, very much.
Thank you. Grazie, arrivederci.